On February 5, 1994, after the explosion at the Markal marketplace in Sarajevo killed dozens of civilians, Christiane Amanpour went on air and said a sentence that could have shaken the career of any journalist. Serbian forces were likely behind the attack. There was no official investigative conclusion yet. Only the scene, the bodies, and a reporter willing to pay a price for refusing to pretend neutrality in the face of violence, repeated again and again. From that moment on, Christiane Amanpour was no longer simply a war correspondent. She became the center of a global controversy over the boundary between objectivity and complicity. Amanpour's talent does not lie in her voice or her on-screen presence. It lies in her ability to stay with a question long enough until power has nowhere left to hide behind safe language. But that choice also pulled her into a professional tragedy, being labeled biased, having every word scrutinized, and living for years in a state of tension, caught between the truth she had witnessed and the cost of naming it. Amanpour's life is a chain of contradictions that cannot be reconciled. A child raised between Iran and the West, between religion and secular life, she understood early that history can strip away a home in a single night. A journalist standing in the middle of war who does not believe in a safe distance. A woman who moved close to power at the center of the world, yet always kept herself in a position that did not belong to it. Behind the image of being fearless are exhaustion, loss, personal choices worn down by the job, and a body that, in the end, was forced to speak in place of sheer will. This is not a story about courage made luminous. This is the journey of someone who accepted not being liked, as long as the question had not been flattened by silence. Christiane Amanpour was born in London in 1958, into a family where stability existed only as a surface. Her father was Iranian, working in the national airline industry. Her mother was English and Roman Catholic. Two cultures, two religions, two systems of norms lived under one roof, without open conflict, yet never truly blending into one. The child growing up in the middle became accustomed to listening more than asserting, accustomed to adjusting herself to different spaces, different expectations. Amanpour's early years were tied to Tehran before the Islamic Revolution. It was a city still open, where women appeared in public life as something ordinary. That atmosphere did not create a spirit of rebellion, but it planted a quiet, underlying sense. The world can function in many different ways, and no way is guaranteed to last forever. That sense would return again and again later, every time Amanpour witnessed an order collapse. At 11, she was sent to England to board at a Catholic girls' school. The separation came early, not dramatic, but decisive. Far from family, far from a familiar language, living inside a disciplinary system where obedience mattered more than being understood. There, silence was not weakness, but a survival skill. Amanpour learned to observe before speaking, learned to memorize details, and learned how to exist without needing to be seen. These were not qualities that drew praise, but they took root deeply. In 1979, the Iranian Islamic Revolution erupted. In a short time, her family lost their work, their standing, and their ability to continue living within the order they had known. They were forced to leave Iran, with few options, and no time to prepare for what separation would mean. This was the first time Amanpour directly witnessed how quickly political power can overturn human fate. War and revolution from that point on were no longer abstract concepts. They became forces that cut straight through real lives, regardless of how those individuals had chosen to live. That loss did not produce in Amanpour a long-consuming nostalgia. It produced a durable reflex, distrust political narratives told from a distance, and refuse silence in the face of imposition. The memory of losing Iran would follow her throughout her career, as a reminder that history always touches people directly, including those who had no power to choose. Entering adulthood in the United States, Christiane Amanpour studied journalism at the University of Rhode Island. The choice of field did not come with a grand statement of ideals. It grew out of a reflex formed early. If major events could sweep away private life so quickly, there had to be a way to understand them and to track them from the inside. In Western education, Amanpour remained in the position she knew best: the outsider. A different voice, a different background. Political memories unlike most of her classmates. She did not fully belong to the story America was telling about itself, yet she no longer stood within any homeland order she could return to. Rather than dissolve into the environment, Amanpour learned to watch society from a position that did not fully belong to either side. During her studies, she worked at the student radio station and a local television channel, taking on technical jobs behind the camera. She did not enter journalism through presence, but through watching how information was selected, framed, and broadcast, who was allowed to speak, who was edited out, and where silence appeared. That experience gradually formed a professional habit that would stay with her for a long time. Not to stand entirely with power, not to stand entirely with the audience, but to hold the position of a responsible witness. When she graduated in 1983 with honors, Christiane Amanpour did not leave the classroom with illusions about journalism as a path to fame. What she carried instead was an early understanding, accumulated from a multi-identity family, from the experience of exile, from years of living on the margins. Those who stand between structures of power are easily misunderstood, and if no one is patient enough to keep asking until the end, silence will quickly be accepted as the safest choice. From that foundation, the way Amanpour would practice journalism, along with the controversies and wounds that came with it, was almost shaped long before she ever appeared on television. That same year, Amanpour entered CNN in Atlanta in a position almost no one noticed: a desk assistant at the foreign desk, handling tapes, monitoring news wires, supporting rough edits. The best work was the work that left no trace. In an environment still accustomed to favoring a standard American voice and camera-friendly faces, her unfamiliar accent and non-American background placed her among the background workers, necessary for the machine, but not yet someone worth betting on. The dismissal came in a quiet form. No one said it outright. Opportunities simply passed her by and went to someone else. What remained were the risky assignments. Harsh conditions, long stretches of time, little chance of going on air. Amanpour took those leftovers as her way forward, not to prove she was brave, but to go where competition was thinner, where if she succeeded, no one could say she had merely got lucky. In the mid-1980s, Christiane Amanpour was assigned to Eastern Europe, working out of Frankfurt and moving constantly through countries caught in a difficult-to-name state of transition. On the surface, the slogans remained intact. The communiques were still read in the familiar order. But life, underneath, had begun to shift. She saw decay arriving not as a single collapse, but revealed through meetings that dragged on without decisions, through the tired voices of officials repeating words that had lost their force, and through silences appearing precisely where commands should have been. The order still stood in form, but belief had withdrawn long before. Small signs carried their own weight. State-run shops opened on time, but the shelves slowly emptied. People queued not because of hope, but because there was no other choice. In moments like these, Amanpour began to leave behind the habit of simply reading the communiqué. She started tracking what was not being said and realized that the political moment we later name can arrive quickly, but what lasts longest is often outside the camera frame, life continuing inside an order that has already lost its power. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, the Gulf War did not merely open a new military conflict, it placed CNN before an unprecedented test. For the first time, a cable news network pursued the model of 24/7 coverage from the battlefield, turning war into a continuous stream of images, bulletins, and analysis. In that structure, the reporter was no longer merely a transmitter of information, but part of the way war itself was seen and understood. Christiane Amanpour emerged at exactly the period when CNN was redefining itself, and from there, redefining her own path as well. Amanpour was present on the front lines inside an environment tightly controlled by the military and censorship systems. What was allowed on air was largely clean imagery. Operational maps, military briefings, technical language, and rounded-off concepts designed to avoid emotional disturbance. This approach enabled audiences to follow the war as a chain of strategic developments, but it also made it easier to experience it as a power game rather than a human catastrophe. Amanpour did not resist head-on, but she constantly pushed the boundary. Instead of clinging solely to military developments, she sought ways to tell the stories outside the communiqué. The lives of civilians trapped between front lines, consequences absent from operational maps, small details that could not be reversed. Her reports, therefore, carried a different tone, less language of victory, more human presence. For Amanpour, war was not only about who wins and who loses, but who pays, and how they pay. After her first Gulf reports, Christiane Amanpour was no longer just a name in the assignment roster. In internal editorial meetings, her name was mentioned not as a face to be promoted, but as someone who repeatedly pulled the news off the familiar safe trajectory. New assignments came not because of celebrity, but because her approach could not be replaced by operational maps or standardized language. To audiences, Amanpour gradually appeared as a voice unwilling to let war be presented in a sterile form. But that very choice quickly placed her under a microscope. In political circles and part of academia, labels began to surface. Too emotional, stepping beyond the standard of neutrality. The Gulf War did not only bring Amanpour into the light, it also placed her on a professional track where every question could be treated as overstepping, and every way of telling the story could carry consequences longer than the broadcast itself. In truth, Amanpour did not stand alone at the scene. She belonged to a generation of international journalists confronting live televised war for the first time. A stream in which access could become a condition for reporting in rhythm. There were forms of practice that prioritized maintaining deep access within controlled zones, staying close to military sources and the cadence of official briefings. And there were other forms willing to stand slightly off that orbit, pulling the story outside the map and technical language, toward the people not counted in the equation of victory and defeat. Amanpour leaned toward the latter. She did not create confrontation through declarations. She created difference by staying with consequences that did not make the report cleaner, and by keeping questions open longer than was usually permitted. From that position, the road leading her to Bosnia was almost already laid out. From 1992, when the Bosnian War erupted, Christiane Amanpour was in Sarajevo, a city under continuous siege, almost cut off from the outside world. Shelling happened daily. Snipers appeared along civilian routes. Schools, hospitals, markets, and residential areas were no longer neutral spaces. Violence moved directly into ordinary life, not to the rhythm of battles, but to the rhythm of survival. Sarajevo was not a hot spot observed from a distance. There, no safe distance existed between the reporter and the event. For Amanpour, this was not simply the next assignment, and it was a space that forced every journalistic habit to endure a test. Her first reports from Sarajevo still carried the familiar structure of international journalism: developments, official statements, situation updates. The city was besieged, transport disrupted, electricity and water intermittent. Civilians lived under shelling and snipers as a prolonged condition. But staying long enough, that structure began to show its limits. Violence was no longer sudden enough to be named as an event. It repeated itself daily, along civilian routes, around school hours, around the opening hours of the market. Neutral language no longer clarified the situation. It began to blur the consequences. In 1994, after the explosion at the Markal marketplace in Sarajevo, Amanpour went on air with the assessment that Serbian forces were likely behind the attack. At that moment, the official investigative conclusion had not yet been released. The statement immediately became the anchor point for the biggest controversy of her career. In an article published in the New York Times on October 9, 1994, Stephen Kinzer argued that Amanpour had speculated beyond the evidence and lost objectivity. The dispute did not revolve around emotion or style, but around professional boundaries. Pressure intensified, from outside and from within. Not as a demand to withdraw, but as relentless questioning. When is a reporter describing, and when is she concluding? In Sarajevo, that boundary did not stand still. Some nights, Amanpour watched her own footage again, weighing every sentence, whether naming a likelihood was going too far, and whether absolute caution was slowing the recognition of a pattern of violence repeated long enough that it could no longer be treated as random. Those doubts never appeared on air. They lived in the gap between the field and the editing room, between what could be said and what kept happening. When one side is hunted, detained, and killed systematically, maintaining formal balance begins to create a different effect. Neutral language no longer clarifies the situation. It blurs the consequences. Amanpour's response to criticism did not come as an immediate declaration. It formed gradually through repeated comparison between official statements and what was real on the ground. When she later said that in genocide, neutrality is complicity, it was a professional boundary drawn only after other choices had revealed their limits. After Bosnia, every time Amanpour went on air, she moved more slowly, in a very specific way. The script was checked more carefully. Details were held in place longer. Small deviations no longer slipped by so easily. At the same time, she appeared more and more frequently on CNN's conflict lines, not because of a different tone, but because of prolonged presence in places where consequences could not be concealed. CNN's decision not to demand that she change her way of telling stories both opened a path and quietly closed off other possible turns. As she continued reporting from Rwanda, Afghanistan, or Iraq, Amanpour did not look for ready-made frames to place events inside. She followed familiar delays between declarations and action, between promises and lived reality. That rhythm of observation did not stop when she left the field. It followed her out of war zones, seeping into her working habits, into stretches of time that were supposed to be safe. Bosnia did not force Amanpour to declare anything. It simply made the old standards impossible to hold. From then on, every report became a concrete choice, made under conditions that did not allow a return to the starting point. And in that space, Amanpour stayed, long enough that she could not be ignored, even as she remained in a position that made others uneasy. Christiane Amanpour's position inside CNN shifted quietly. She was brought into different spaces, places where power did not fire guns, but left consequences that lasted longer. From the mid-1990s, Amanpour began collaborating with 60 Minutes, stepping from the field into zones of a more intricate kind of danger. At 60 Minutes, conflict appeared through conference tables, diplomatic agreements, and decisions wrapped in polite language. Amanpour approached leaders, centers of power, systems that were accustomed to operating outside the light. The question moved from who is shooting whom to who decides and where do the consequences fall. This was not a change of role, but a continuation of the same habit, staying with a question precisely when it begins to be avoided. Her interviews were not designed to manufacture shock. Amanpour asked slowly, asked again, and allowed silence to generate its own pressure. That method pushed powerful figures into answering outside their habitual scripts. 2 Peabody Awards came from the accumulation of such conversations. Spaces where power gradually revealed itself through its own words. The closer she moved to the center, the sharper the personal distance became. Working between CNN and 60 Minutes meant constant movement between battlefield and closed rooms, between the scene and the negotiating table. Amanpour stood on that boundary, carrying a kind of professional loneliness, where every question leaves an aftershock and every dialogue makes the room tighten. No longer the familiar imagery of war zones. Only a different pressure taking shape, power surrounding her, silent, waiting for a mistake. In that space, Amanpour kept her old rhythm, not stepping back when an answer became uncomfortable. After September 11, 2001, Amanpour's world entered familiar territory, but at an intensity she had never known. Afghanistan, then Iraq, and then the broader Middle East were reorganized under a new label, global war. No longer scattered hotspots. Everything connected into a continuous chain of terror, counterattack, occupation, and retaliation. For Amanpour, this was not a new war to find her footing in, but an uninterrupted extension of what she had witnessed throughout the previous decade. Except that this time, there was no pause. The pace of work grew relentless. Constant movement between Kabul, Baghdad, Middle Eastern capitals, and Western centers of power. News no longer followed a cycle. It flooded the air 24/7. With the expectation that reporters must always be present, always ready to explain, always capable of preserving moral sharpness inside a context growing ever more polarized. Amanpour kept asking hard questions, kept standing between opposing political pressures, kept witnessing a widening gap between declarations and real life. But this time, repetition began leaving marks. By the mid-2000s, Amanpour gradually pulled back from the front lines in a very private way. Not a declared decision, and not a retreat from journalism. She continued working, continued interviewing, continued appearing at key points. But she was less present where violence unfolded directly. This was not fear of physical danger. It was the consequence of prolonged, accumulated tension. Too many deaths witnessed, too many promises repeated, too many cycles of conflict returning to the same starting point. During that period, Amanpour's presence began to change pace. Less movement, longer gaps between trips. Not to avoid war, but to preserve the ability to keep looking directly at it without being worn away from within. Exhaustion did not appear on air, was not named, not explained. It showed itself through a slower rhythm of work, through a shift in focus, from the field to dialogue, from direct witnessing to asking questions in the spaces where decisions are formed. There was no clear boundary that could be marked as an ending. Only a different way of staying, more cautious and persistent in a different sense. That shift became unmistakable when Amanpour began hosting a program bearing her name. No longer tied to the urgent tempo of the field, she created a space of dialogue, where conflict was not told through images, but through language and responsibility. Amanpour did not operate as a talk show, nor did she chase confrontations. Questions were designed to prolong pressure, not to close it. In the studio, Amanpour carried the experience of years of war, understanding how power speaks in circles, how silence can be used as a tactic. The interviews were not meant to clarify positions, but to trace consequences, from policy decisions to lives in places that never appear on screen. This was not leaving war behind, but changing where she stood. Instead of witnessing consequences, she faced the people who produced them. Danger no longer had a visible shape, but the pressure remained, quiet, prolonged, and not easy to step away from. In 2010, Christiane Amanpour left CNN to host This Week on ABC News, a program operating by an entirely different logic. A crowded roundtable, fast cuts, a host expected to keep the argument moving by interrupting, pivoting, and pushing dialogue toward clear confrontation. In one of her first broadcasts, when the debate began accelerating, Amanpour asked a question and then paused. A habit formed across many years. That silence was not allowed to remain. The camera cut to a different angle. Someone else jumped in. The program's rhythm kept running, leaving the question unanswered in full. There was no on-air clash, but the mismatch was already unmistakable, not between viewpoints, but between how time was being used. On This Week, time is a competitive unit. In Amanpour's way of working, time is an instrument of pressure. The two do not cancel each other out, but they cannot run in parallel. The episodes that followed did not produce explosive moments. The show did not fail in content, but it did not generate the gravitational pull that the ecosystem of American political television was seeking. Ratings reflected that faster than any professional assessment ever could. 2 years later, Amanpour returned to CNN International. There was no statement of adjustment, no effort at repositioning. Long interviews, with fewer cuts and no forced win-lose framing, were reinstated as a default. Conversations no longer had to race toward a moment, but lasted long enough for arguments to reveal their own shape. Power was not pushed into instant confrontation. It was held in place, given enough time for its own words to create pressure. Parallel to CNN, Amanpour expanded her space for dialogue on PBS with Amanpour and Company. Here, time was no longer an external constraint. Exchanges unfolded long enough for reasoning to expose itself, slow enough for silences to speak. There was no need to manufacture tension, only the persistence of asking questions inside a frame that allowed complexity to exist in full. This rhythm of journalism was closer to what Amanpour had accumulated over decades. No need to win a debate, only the need to keep the question from being flattened. But as the space for dialogue widened on air, Christiane Amanpour's private life did not slow down. It continued operating within the same tension, shaped directly by how she stayed engaged with the outside world, where decisions always moved ahead of consequences, and presence rarely allowed withdrawal from responsibility. Christiane Amanpour's marriage did not begin as an escape from that outside world. It was formed at the very center of global power, where international journalism and state diplomacy operate side by side, sometimes touching, sometimes forced to keep their distance. When Amanpour married James Rubin, a senior U.S. diplomat, the surface of the relationship looked harmonious. Two people accustomed to closed-door meetings, official travel, and decisions capable of shifting history. But that very compatibility placed them in a tension that was difficult to name. Amanpour practiced journalism by keeping her distance from power. Rubin worked from inside that power. The two trajectories did not collide head-on, but they never truly aligned. In shared life, professional boundaries were not drawn by words, but by what could not be talked about. Topics quietly moved aside, silences made necessary to avoid conflicts of interest. Amanpour did not justify her independence. She accepted scrutiny as part of the professional cost, deliberately stepping back from directly related dossiers, remaining silent when suspicion rose, and continuing to work in a gray zone without any political home to return to. Family life, therefore, had no fixed center in which time could gather. It was organized around work schedules, movement, and public duties. Time was broken into travel, broadcast windows, political flashpoints. Home existed as a temporary stop, not a place where time could be held. There were no explosive conflicts and no romantic moments preserved, only a rhythm always moving ahead of its own consequences. Motherhood did not become an emotional counterweight strong enough to pull Amanpour out of that orbit. It simply placed another layer of responsibility onto a structure already under strain. She did not idealize the role, nor did she tell the family story as compensation for professional life. Her child was kept out of public view, not out of avoidance, but because it was the one part of life that had to be protected from the logic of observation and judgment. In the familiar choices of journalism, go or stay, ask or remain silent, there was now always an added consequence that could not be pushed aside. Two people accustomed to high intensity inside two different systems, neither had the advantage of slowing down first. The family did not break in a single event. It wore down through repeated absence, through missed presences, through the sense that shared space was shrinking while individual trajectories continued as before. No scandal, no public crisis, only a prolonged fatigue, large enough that it could not be reversed by solitary effort. After many years of living under constant tension, Christiane Amanpour's body began responding in a way that required no interpretation, not through a sudden collapse, but through scattered signals, sustained fatigue, a sense of being out of sync between willpower and physical endurance. In a life trained to place duty ahead of personal sensation, these signs were not immediately treated as warnings. They were postponed, like so many other things postponed for work, for responsibility, for an outside world that always demanded presence. The divorce arrived as the remainder of a life rhythm already worn thin. It unfolded quietly, in the same manner the relationship had existed for years. Few words, little explanation, and more empty space than argument. Afterward, Amanpour's life tightened into a new discipline. Her schedule remained heavy, but her private boundaries were built more firmly. The parts of life belonging to family were kept away from public view by a practical principle. Some things can only survive when they are not turned into material for interpretation. Her body continued sending signals without commentary, prolonged fatigue, less frequent movement. Between trips, longer breaks, as if she were redistributing endurance. This change did not appear as a declaration, but as a steady adjustment. The center of gravity shifting from the field to dialogue, from direct witnessing to questioning in the places where decisions are formed. In 2021, Christiane Amanpour was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, a disease that rarely reveals itself through clear signs in its early stages. The discovery did not come from a sharp pain or a sudden incident, but from vague signals accumulating over time. Prolonged fatigue, a bodily rhythm slipping out of sync with her accustomed endurance. In a life trained to place duty ahead of personal sensation, those signs had been postponed, like so many other things delayed for work, for broadcast schedules, for an outside world that always demanded presence. Once the diagnosis was confirmed, treatment began immediately, following a cold and precise medical order: surgery, then chemotherapy. Amanpour made her illness public after treatment had already begun, not as a call for sympathy, but as information that needed to be known. The way she shared it reflected the professional habit that had followed her for decades, not telling the story while it is still being used to reassure, only speaking once it has become a reality that must be faced. Treatment forced the rhythm of life to slow down in a way that could not be negotiated. Time was no longer measured by travel schedules or news cycles, but by the body's capacity to recover. Control. The thing that had once helped Amanpour stay upright amid war and crisis now became a different concept, not mastering the situation, but accepting limits. That state did not produce a psychological crisis with a name. It showed itself through small but decisive adjustments. Fewer appearances, a narrowed sphere of engagement, and more careful choices about when it was necessary to speak. When she returned to the air, Amanpour kept her familiar interviewing voice, but time was used more tightly. Every interview carried the weight of a choice, not to prove endurance, but to preserve the ability to remain present without trading away what was left of the body. Professional boundaries that had existed before were no longer flexible. When she refused to wear a headscarf in a high-level interview, she cited professional principle, not personal circumstance. When she disagreed over how Gaza was being covered, she chose arguments about journalistic responsibility rather than the language of confrontation. Those frictions did not erupt into climactic drama, were not performed as moments of courage. They occurred exactly where boundaries were being redrawn, between working conditions and the ability to keep staying in the profession. After treatment, Amanpour appeared less often. But every time she spoke, she carried the entire accumulated history of her work. Not to assert position, not to close debate, but to keep enough space in dialogue for difficult questions to exist. Illness did not soften her, nor did it turn her into an icon of overcoming. It forced every choice to become clearer and every appearance to be weighed all the way through. In a life built on the ability to stay inside crisis, this was one of the rare moments in which Amanpour had to learn how to stay with her own body, not through declarations, but through discipline. In recent years, Christiane Amanpour's professional life has not shrunk. It has changed tempo. She remains a steady presence on CNN International and PBS, but no longer as two parallel spaces needing balance. One rhythm follows global movement closely. One rhythm allows questions to be held longer. Both serve the same habit formed very early: not filling the silence too quickly and not withdrawing when dialogue begins to feel uncomfortable. From this position, Amanpour does not need to assert her presence. She is there as a familiar anchor of dialogue amid a news stream that is increasingly fast and increasingly fragile. Along the same axis, The X-Files, co-hosted with her ex-husband, does not appear as a separate branch of private life, nor as a staged gesture of reconciliation. It exists as another sign of the same survival skill: the ability to continue dialogue after identities have broken. No longer the role of marriage, no longer the parallel status of power. Only two people who once shared a tense rhythm, questioning each other inside a space no longer burdened by the duty to prove anything. There, dialogue does not rely on position, but on the ability to listen, and on the decision to stay when silence begins to carry weight. Amanpour's recent professional frictions have not appeared as climactic controversy. They happen quietly, in moments when boundaries are set again. Sometimes the boundary lies between working conditions and professional identity. Sometimes it appears inside the organization she is tied to. between political pressure, editorial choices, and responsibility to the field. Amanpour continues to stand in her familiar place, not choosing the easy side, not withdrawing from conflict. She keeps the tone of questioning rather than the tone of confrontation, accepting the tension that comes with never standing fully on one side. Christiane Amanpour's life now does not resemble withdrawal. It is a state of selective presence. Every time she speaks is accompanied by a boundary carefully considered. Less, slower, but not softer. Not chasing climax. Not avoiding friction, only keeping the space of dialogue wide enough, where power is forced to answer and questions are not flattened by the convenience of silence. In recent years, Amanpour's influence rarely appears in a form that is explicitly named. It shows itself in the rhythm of interviews where the interviewer does not rush to fill the gap. There are moments when Amanpour asks a question and then stops, letting silence generate its own pressure on the person across from her. Not to provoke tension, but to see what will be said when the script no longer has enough force to shield. That method is not common in a news environment driven by fast reflexes, but it survives as a persistent professional choice, one in which power is not pushed into instant confrontation, but held in place long enough to reveal its shape through its own words. From the Gulf War to Bosnia, Amanpour has been seen as a fearless reporter, not because she sought danger, but because she refused to withdraw once the question began to feel uncomfortable. The way she reported war always returned human beings to the center, while official language often tried to make them disappear. For Amanpour, conflict is not located in maps or strategies, but in lives cut through, and in consequences that do not leave once the headline has moved on. A professional principle was formed in Bosnia and never left her afterward. Neutrality does not mean distributing emotion evenly or flattening every side. Objectivity, in that understanding, means allowing each side to be heard without surrendering the right to name structures of violence that have repeated long enough to no longer be accidental. That principle explains why Amanpour repeatedly clashes with power, why she rarely feels safe, and why her interviews are not meant to reach consensus, but to extend responsibility to answer. Alongside reporting, Amanpour has turned battlefield experience into public action, participating in structures that protect journalists, pushing for operational safety, and serving as a UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador for freedom of expression. Their personal memory is not narrated as inspiration, but transformed into a condition for truth to continue existing. And perhaps after decades spent at the point where history breaks, the hardest question is no longer on the battlefield. It comes in the moment the camera turns off. When someone has spent a lifetime forcing power to answer, what remains most difficult is continuing to face the world, or learning how to live normally in silences where there are no longer questions left to hold.